There are places hidden in North Carolina that most people do not know exist. A ghost town on a barrier island that was once the busiest port south of Norfolk, accessible today only by boat. A lumber boom town that disappeared so completely under the swamp water that kayakers now paddle over the streets where 3,000 people once lived. A mill town so perfectly frozen in time that Hollywood used it as the setting for a post-apocalyptic film. North Carolina stretches from the Outer Banks to the Great Smoky Mountains, and in every region of the state there are places that were built, inhabited, and then left behind. Hurricanes destroyed coastal communities. Floods swept away mountain towns. The creation of national parks displaced entire communities from the Appalachians. And lumber companies built cities for their workers and abandoned them when the forest ran out. Textile factories created self-sufficient villages where families lived and worked for generations, then shut the factories and left the villages to rot when they found cheaper labor elsewhere. In this video, we are going to discover 10 of those places. From the swamps of the coast to the deepest valleys of the mountains, this is the North Carolina that modern maps prefer not to show you. Number 10. Mortimer. In the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, hidden within what is today the Pisgah National Forest, the ghost town of Mortimer was once a thriving mill village of around 800 people. The town was built in the early 20th century when lumber barons arrived and saw the vast hardwood forests of the surrounding mountains. A railroad was built, a mill was raised, company housing was constructed for workers and their families, stores opened, a school was established. Mortimer had everything a small mountain community needed. Then in 1916, a catastrophic flood roared through Wilson Creek Gorge and devastated the town. The water came down the mountain with the force of a freight train, dragging rocks and debris and everything in its path. The damage was severe, but the residents of Mortimer were mountain people. They rebuilt for 2 more decades. The town kept going. The mill ran, and the families stayed. Then in 1940, a second flood, even more destructive than the first, wiped out what remained. The 1940 flood was one of the worst natural disasters in the history of Western North Carolina, and Mortimer took its full force. This time, nobody rebuilt. The 800 survivors scattered to other towns, and Mortimer was given over to the forest. Today, the ruins of Mortimer are hidden within Pisgah National Forest near the Mortimer Campground. Foundations jut through the undergrowth. Scattered remains of mill machinery lie where they were left more than 80 years ago. The forest has reclaimed almost everything, but if you know where to look, the bones of a town are still there. On Google Maps, the area around Mortimer appears as National Forest. The town itself does not exist. Number 9. Buffalo City. In the coastal plain of northeastern North Carolina, in the dense wetlands of Dare County, there was once a lumber boom town called Buffalo City, founded after the Civil War. The town grew quickly when lumber companies arrived to harvest the vast cypress and juniper forests of the region. At its peak, Buffalo City had approximately 3,000 residents, multiple sawmills, a rail spur to move the lumber, saloons, and the reputation of being the moonshine capital of the United States. The swamp offered perfect cover for clandestine distilling operations. The cypress trees blocked lines of sight. The water made the roads impassable for outsiders. Tax revenue agents who tried to raid the stills often got lost in the swamp or simply gave up. It was one of those places where geographical isolation and the determination of its inhabitants had created a world that ran by its own rules. When the timber ran out in the early 20th century, the sawmills closed. The population drained away, and the swamp, which had been held back by the constant activity of logging and clearing, began advancing again. Today, Buffalo City has been completely consumed by the landscape. Swamp water covers the streets. The forest has grown over the foundations. Kayakers and paddlers who navigate the area pass over the remains of a town that once had thousands of residents without knowing what lies beneath them. In some places, the pilings of old structures poke through the dark water. Alligators and snakes have replaced the lumberjacks and distillers. On Google Maps, Buffalo City appears as a label in the middle of a swamp. There are no roads leading to it, no visible structures, only water and trees where a town once stood. Number 8. Lost Cove. High in the mountains of western North Carolina, it on 350 acres of dense forest above the Nolichucky River near the Tennessee border, the ghost town of Lost Cove is exactly what its name suggests. The community was founded in the 1860s and sustained itself for nearly a century through farming, timber, and moonshine. There was never electricity in Lost Cove, never running water or telephone service. Residents cultivated the steep mountain soil, raised livestock, traded with neighboring communities by walking trails that wound over the mountain ridges, and built an intimate life among the peaks that needed almost nothing from the outside world. They were born in Lost Cove, married in Lost Cove, and buried in Lost Cove. The outside world barely knew they existed. It was the kind of community that 20th century modernization made increasingly incomprehensible to those living outside it, and increasingly difficult to sustain for those living within. But the isolation that had protected Lost Cove for generations eventually became its undoing. The timber ran out. The trails connecting the settlement to the outside world never improved into passable roads. Younger generations left for towns where life was easier and jobs were available. By 1958, the last residents had gone. Today, crumbling chimneys stand like sentinels in the forest. Rusted farming tools lie where they were last set down. Moss-covered foundations trace the footprint of houses where families lived for nearly a century. An old car sits forgotten on the mountain slope. It's too heavy to remove and too remote for anyone to bother salvaging. Hikers who make the difficult trek to Lost Cove describe an unsettling calm, the feeling of standing in a place where time simply stopped. On Google Maps, Lost Cove does not appear. The area is part of Pisgah National Forest, and the trails leading to it are not marked. Number 7. Henry River Mill Village. Near the small town of Hildebrand at the foot of the Appalachian Mountains, the Henry River Mill Village was built in 1905 to house the workers of a cotton textile mill. The town was a self-sufficient community where workers earned $1 a day and spent most of it at the company store. For a brief period, the town even had its own currency called the Dougaloo, which could only be used at the local grocery store. There was no running water. Families hauled water from the river and heated it on wood stoves. Children worked in the mill alongside their parents, operating machinery that could take a finger or a hand in an instant, until child labor laws forced that practice to stop. The mill created an insular world. Workers were born in the village, worked in the mill, shopped at the company store, and were buried in the town cemetery. Many never left. The mill ran for decades before closing in the 1970s. The workers left, and the remaining houses in the village were abandoned. Around 20 wooden houses remained standing, their porches sagging, their windows broken, their interiors slowly filling with ivy and decay. The scene became so perfectly dystopian that in 2011, Hollywood came looking for it. The Hunger Games filmed its District 12 scenes at Henry River Mill Village, and using the abandoned houses as the backdrop for Katniss Everdeen's impoverished home district. The village was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 2019, and restoration work has since begun. Visitors can now walk the grounds, peer into the houses, and even spend the night in a restored mill house. Ghost tours are offered. Locals claim the spirits of former workers still haunt the village, and some say they have seen phantom lanterns moving between the houses after dark. Number 6. Brunswick Town. Halfway between Wilmington and Southport on the banks of the Cape Fear River, the ruins of Brunswick Town mark the site of a colonial settlement that changed the course of American history twice, in 2 different wars, 2 centuries apart. Brunswick Town was a thriving port in the 1700s, one of the most important in the colony of North Carolina. Ships loaded with naval stores, lumber, and provisions sailed from its docks to ports across the Atlantic. The colonial governor held court here. Merchants built substantial houses along the riverfront. It was a place that believed in its own permanence with all the solidity of the stone with which it built its warehouses. Then, During the Revolutionary War, British forces burned it to the ground in 1776 as punishment for the colony's defiance. The town was never rebuilt. Survivors scattered to Wilmington and other settlements along the Cape Fear River. For nearly a century, the ruins lay forgotten in the coastal forest, slowly sinking into the sandy soil. Then came the Civil War. Confederate forces built Fort Anderson directly over the colonial ruins, using the old foundations as part of their earthworks. The fort was one of the last Confederate strongholds to fall in the war. Today, Brunswick Town and Fort Anderson exist as a single historic site, one layered over the other. Colonial-era brick foundations sit alongside Civil War earthworks. Trails wind between the ruins, and the combination of two separate historical eras occupying the same ground creates an atmosphere that has no equal in the state. The site was even used as a filming location for Sleepy Hollow. Number 5. Portsmouth Island. At the southern end of the Outer Banks, accessible only by boat, Portsmouth Island holds the remains of a town that was once the busiest port south of Norfolk, Virginia. Founded in 1753, Portsmouth served as a lightering station where cargo was transferred from large ocean-going ships to smaller vessels that could navigate the shallow sounds behind the barrier islands. For more than a century, the town prospered. At its peak, nearly 700 people lived on Portsmouth Island, earning their living from the sea, from maritime trade, and from the dangerous work of piloting vessels through the treacherous waters of Ocracoke Inlet. Hurricanes and economic shifts slowly eroded the population. The Civil War disrupted the trade routes and damaged the infrastructure on which the town depended. A series of devastating storms in the late 19th century destroyed houses and redistributed the sand on which the town was built. The invention of deeper draft channels at other ports made latering obsolete, eliminating Portsmouth's economic reason for existence. By the early 20th century, Portsmouth was in sharp decline. The post office closed, the school closed. Families left one by one until only a handful of elderly residents remained, living in houses their grandparents had built. The last two residents, Marion Babb and Elma Dixon, left the island in 1971. Today, more than 20 buildings remain standing on Portsmouth Island, including a church, a general store, a life-saving station, and several houses. The village is maintained by the National Park Service as part of Cape Lookout National Seashore. Visitors arrive by ferry and walk through a perfectly preserved coastal ghost house, where the only sounds are the wind, the waves, and the calls of shorebirds. On Google Maps, Portsmouth Island is visible. But the village appears as a handful of small rectangles on an otherwise empty strip of sand. Nothing on the map conveys the experience of standing in a place where 700 people once lived and where the Atlantic Ocean is now the only neighbor. Number 4. Ghost Town in the Sky. High on Buck Mountain above the town of Maggie Valley, the remains of an amusement park called Ghost Town in the Sky sit at an elevation that earned it the nickname of North Carolina's theme park, A Mile in the Sky. The park opened on May 1st, 1961, and was for decades one of the most popular tourist attractions in western North Carolina. It could only be reached via a chairlift of more than 3,000 feet or a funicular, both of which carried visitors from the mountain base to an Old West-themed town on the summit. There were staged gunfights in the streets, roller coasters that hugged the mountain ridge, a saloon, a jail, rides for children and adults, gift shops selling cowboy hats and toy pistols. At its peak, Ghost Town in the Sky drew 500,000 visitors a year. Entire generations of North Carolina families grew up visiting the park. For many, it was as much a part of childhood as the beach or the mountains. The park closed and reopened several times over the years as it changed hands and financial problems accumulated. Landslides damaged the chairlift. Investors came and went. Revival plans were announced and then quietly abandoned. The park finally closed permanently in the 2000s. The rides were left in place. The buildings were boarded up. The chairlift stopped running. The gunfighters stopped fighting. Today, yes, the remains of the park are visible in satellite images, the outlines of rides and buildings still recognizable on the mountaintop. but the site is closed to the public and monitored. For an entire generation of North Carolinians who visited as children, Ghost Town in the Sky is not just an abandoned theme park. It is a piece of their childhood they can never return to. Number 3. Cataloochee. Before the Great Smoky Mountains became a national park, more than 1,200 people lived in the Cataloochee Valley. Families had farmed and raised livestock in this remote mountain valley since the early 19th century, building churches, schools, homes, and a community that was self-sufficient and deeply rooted in the land. The valley was so isolated that for much of its history, so the only way in or out was on foot or horseback along narrow mountain trails. Despite the isolation, or perhaps because of it, Cataloochee developed its own character. By the early 20th century, the valley had a working school system, active churches, and it was estimated that 95% of households participated in the production or sale of moonshine. The moonshine economy was not a secret. It was simply how mountain people made a living when the land alone was not enough. It was a world that had learned to operate with its own resources and its own rules, and had done so well for more than a century. When the federal government created Great Smoky Mountains National Park in the 1930s, Cataloochee's residents were forced to sell their land and leave. Some went willingly, yet taking the government money and starting over in towns with electricity and running water. Many did not. Families who had lived in the valley for 5 or 6 generations resisted the buyouts, arguing that the government had no right to take land that had been in their families since before North Carolina was a state. The last holdouts were removed in the 1940s, some of them taken out by federal marshals. Today, the National Park Service maintains several of the original Cataloochee buildings, including churches, homes, a school, and barns. Elk now graze in the fields where crops once grew. The valley is one of the most beautiful and least visited areas of the national park, accessible only by a narrow, winding mountain road that discourages casual tourists. On Google Maps, Cataloochee appears as a label within Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The buildings are too small to see in satellite images. The valley that was home to more than 1,000 people for more than a century looks like just another fold in the mountains. Number 2. The layered erasure of North Carolina. Here is what most people do not understand about abandoned places in North Carolina. The state did not lose its ghost towns to a single cause. It lost them to everything. Hurricanes destroyed coastal communities on the Outer Banks. Floods swept away mountain towns in the Blue Ridge. The creation of national parks and federal lakes displaced entire communities in the Smokies. Lumber companies stripped the forests of the coastal plain and the mountains, built towns to house the workers, and abandoned them when the timber ran out. Its textile mills created self-sufficient villages where families lived and worked for decades, earning company currency and shopping at company stores, then shut the mills and left the villages to rot when they found cheaper labor elsewhere. The Tennessee Valley Authority dammed rivers and drowned towns under reservoirs like Lake Fontana, where the rooftops of the submerged town of Judson reportedly appear above the waterline during the most severe droughts, like ghosts breaking the surface. The government promised residents of the flooded communities that it would build a road so they could continue visiting family cemeteries. The road was never finished. Today it ends in an abandoned tunnel carved into a mountainside known locally as the Road to Nowhere. And through all of that, the land absorbed the ruins. Yet the swamp reclaimed Buffalo City. The forest grew over Mortimer and Lost Cove. Sand and wind eroded Diamond City on the Outer Banks, until nothing remained. The abandoned places of North Carolina are not concentrated in one region or tied to one industry. They are everywhere. The mountains, the coast, the Piedmont, every part of the state has places that were built, inhabited, and then quietly left behind. Number 1. The hidden ground of North Carolina. If you drive across North Carolina from one end to the other, you cross 3 distinct landscapes: mountains, Piedmont, coastal plain. Each one seems alive. Each one seems to have always been what it is now. The mountains are covered in rhododendron and hardwood forest. The coast is lined with lighthouses and fishing piers. The Piedmont is crossed by farms and university towns. Yeah, but beneath the surface, there is a layer of abandonment that runs from one end of the state to the other. Mill villages where children worked for $1 a day. Lumber towns where 3,000 people lived in a swamp. Mountain communities where families farmed for a century without electricity before the government told them to leave. Colonial ports burned in one war and fortified in another. Barrier Island towns where 700 people made their living from the sea until the sea took everything. North Carolina does not look abandoned. It looks green and beautiful and full of life. But the green is growing over foundations. The beauty is covering ruins. And the life is happening in places built on top of places that were left behind. Google Maps shows you the highways and the beaches and the national parks. It does not show you the ghost towns hidden in the swamps and the mountains and the barrier islands between them. But they are there. They have been there for a long time. And they are not going anywhere. Closing 10 places, 10 ways North Carolina built and forgot. What sets this state apart from the others we have traveled through in this series is the diversity of causes. There is no single story that explains everything. It is not just the railroad, or just the economy, or just nature. It is all of those things at once, in different corners of the same state, applied with the same indifference to communities that had put everything they had into that place. The families of Lost Cove lived for 4 generations without electricity or running water, because that was the only world they knew, and because that world was enough. The families of Cataloochee were removed by federal marshals from land that their great-grandparents had cleared with axes. The workers of Henry River Mill Village lived and died within a few miles, earning money that could only be spent in the same place where they earned it. They are different stories, but they share something. They share the conviction that the place where you are born and where you work and where you bury your dead is permanent. That the roots you plant will last. Sometimes they last, and sometimes the river rises or the company closes or the government arrives with a paper that says it is no longer yours. North Carolina knows this. Its swamps and its mountains and its islands know it. And the places buried beneath all of that know it too.